Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Bible and Archaeology podcast. I'm so happy once again to be joined by Dr. Cynthia Shafer-Elliott today for a conversation about David and Bathsheba, one of these stories that we're all probably somewhat familiar with. But today we want to consider the story we think we know and what the Bible says about that story and see how David comes out of it at the end. So Cynthia, thank you for taking the time to walk through this with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I think this is probably, an uncomfortable story for a lot of people in many ways. If you really know the story, it's an uncomfortable story. If you only kind of know the story, questioning the story might be an uncomfortable story. So is there anything up front for the audience that we need to put on the table that they should have in mind as we're walking through this today?
That's a good question. Well, I would say anytime you read any ancient literature, and specifically here in our case, the Bible, you have to ask questions and you have to be comfortable with asking questions, or maybe even being uncomfortable asking them, but nevertheless asking them, because these texts, invite the reader to be engaged with it, and we need to ask the questions in order to do a close, careful reading of the text.
And the disclaimer up front, this story and the interpretations or the readings of this story, while you may think there's nothing afoul here, it opens the door to questions of assault and forced sex in this. So now you may up front be going, wait a minute, that's not the version of the story that I know. I'd encourage you to stick around for some of these questions, but we want to make sure that disclaimer is up front. There are some difficult and uncomfortable corners in this story that we're going to be looking at today. So to set the stage a little bit for the audience, remind you of where we're at in the narrative. This story is set during the period of the United Monarchy in the Bible. King David, in the text, is set in Jerusalem, his capital city at that time. Just before this text, we get the wonderful passage in 2 Samuel 7, this promise of this eternal kingship, this line, David, you're going to have a descendant on the throne for forever. And then not too long after that wonderful shining moment for David, we get 2 Samuel 11. And this moment of David and Bathsheba, and that's where we're going to be spending our time at today. And a question up front about maybe defining some of our terms, Cynthia. This story usually gets positioned as David committing an act of adultery. Is that a fair framework for reading this story, or is that immediately something that we need to question and reposition?
Well, usually those superscriptions that you see within your Bibles, those little headings, I guess you could say, those are not part of the actual text. Those are things that the publishers and editors of that particular version of the Bible have inserted into that. And it's a nice way to keep things organized and tidy, but they're also, and at least you can see in this part, kind of showing their cards about how they would interpret this passage. Or maybe they're trying to gloss over some of the more, realistic interpretations, feminist interpretations, womanist interpretations, where David doesn't come out looking so good.
No. Yeah, I think that little line, because as you're reading along, it frames up, and maybe in a way, a lot of times we don't necessarily think about, or you as the reader going through the text, don't think about how much that can set your perspective or what you're looking for or what you're reading for. Because if that moves to, instead of like David commits adultery, David commits assault, what comes after suddenly feels very different. By changing one word, the text is going to stay the same, but that framework is going to significantly change our reading. And so that's some of what we're going to be doing here today, is questioning the framework of the reading of the text. Now, there's going to be a multiplicity of readings that are available with this. We're going to try to complicate that fairly for you today with some of what may or may not be happening. And so I think let's start right in to 2 Samuel 11, verse 1, because this sometimes gets brought up as the first failure of David. In verse 1, we're told that In the spring of the year, the time when the kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with them. They ravaged the Ammonites, besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. So first, right, we have a time of year. We've got spring showing up. And then that David remains at Jerusalem, which becomes very important for the narrative. Is the king being at home rather in battle something that should raise a red flag for us? Or is this a sign of his prestige and his strength? Or what is this verse doing and what it says?
Well, I think our narrator or narrators here are doing a fantastic job setting the scene. I wish they did this more often in our biblical text. That's just a personal preference, however. But I mean, it tells us a couple things, that opening line where our narrators are setting the scene. And like I said, they're doing that so well. For David to be king and to have remained in Jerusalem, to me, from what I know of the wider kind of ancient Near East, this is a sign of him becoming powerful. Mm-hmm. And that, I mean, kings typically were established as kind of the main military chief, and it was part of their responsibility to subdue the enemies and bring peace. But you also see, once a kingdom really established themselves as pretty powerful, or maybe even eventually turn into an empire, the kings send their troops and their military to battle with their commanding officers. So it's not uncommon. I don't think David's doing a bad thing here, but I do think it gives us a clue as to how powerful David is. And we see that power played out in the rest of the text.
Yeah, it is interesting to think through in how it's framing itself. Archaeologically, there's questions to be asked of the strength or the might of the regional powers here. But in this text, right, it does feel like it's really trying to portray him as, I'm so strong, they can go to fight without me. And the military side of David has been such a part of his backstory and his strength that him not being in battle, it happens other places too, but does feel like a real shift for David character-wise, that he's decided to stay back and lounge at home while they go and do the fighting.
Because most of the times that we've seen him up to this point has been as some sort of military figure. Yeah. So now that we've seen this shift where he's not, I think it's an indicator of how much power he actually, and prestige that he has, even as probably a small kingdom. Again, archaeologically, historically, we can get into all those types of questions. But from what the text is trying to tell us, is that David is a powerful figure. And again, we see that played out. It's kind of giving us a clue into this is the type of man he's become. You know, he has all this power and authority. And then the text shows us as how he's used that power and authority for ill.
A very different kind of expression of kingly power in this, which does harken back some to the warning that the Israelites got about if you get a king, they're going to be taking everything from you. They're taking your sons and your daughters to serve them. That here, David, this man after God's own heart, is leaning into kingly power here in some of the most destructive ways, and expressing that maybe by flaunting getting to stay home or in the interactions that we're going to get in 1 second. So let's move to verse 2, right? We've got our nice setting. It's the springtime. All is well in Jerusalem. And it happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, this is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So a lot of questions immediately that we have here. The first, David's walking around on the roof of his house. And can we discuss, we mentioned some of the archaeology here. Is this a normal thing for David to be doing? Is this an abnormal thing? Kings on the roof, is he in danger? What's going on?
It is a normal thing because archaeologically, what we know of Iron Age houses, regardless if they're you're just an average person or, an elite house, is that they are rectangular, typically 2 stories with a flat roof.
Mm-hmm.
And those roofs were used for other things. Like if you recall from Joshua 2, I believe, where Rahab is hiding not 2, but in Joshua, where she's hiding the 2 spies on the roof of her house. She's drying stalks of flax up there, and that's how she hides them. And it's also thought that during the hot summer months, that this is where, people who lived in those houses could sleep. So it's not, abnormal at all. In fact, it's pretty normal. And if you've ever been to Israel, especially in Jerusalem, in the late afternoon, evening, you get those wonderful breezes off the Mediterranean, and it cools things down quite nicely. And so and again, in Jerusalem, most of the buildings are also flat roofed. Mm-hmm. So it's not uncommon for people to use that space, even still today, on the roof of their house. And when you don't have air conditioning, going to the roof of your house to cool off when those breezes come up, because it is springtime from what our narrator says. And again, if you've been to Israel at all, you know that springtime can get quite warm. And so you might want to go onto the roof to enjoy those nice breezes. So what he's doing, both being home and being on the roof of his house, there's nothing wrong with either of those. It's what happens afterwards. That's the problem.
Yeah. So far, David being home and being on the roof, he's in the clear. Not an abnormal thing to be on the roof, but that is one of those details that I think sometimes can feel like, is this just his luxury? Some people look at that like, oh, he's got a palace where he's got this rooftop terrace. Potentially, if there's some sort of palace associated with David, which is a whole other thing. But they're on the roof, but other people could be on the roof as well, which then leads us to the next question in this verse, is that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. Where is the woman bathing? Typically, she gets associated with being on top of the roof. David's on top of a roof. If you see paintings of this or movies, typically she is also on her rooftop bathing. But all it tells us is that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. So does this lead us to believe she's on the roof too, or would she be somewhere else?
Historically, people have confused this passage, either thinking that she's on the roof and David isn't, or that they're both on their, personal roofs of their houses. But the text doesn't say anything about where she is. And if we're just looking at the text, then we cannot make that assumption that she's on the roof of her house. And even if she was on the roof of her house, she would not be doing anything wrong. She would be technically in the privacy of her own home. Mm-hmm. But however, I have seen really no evidence, archaeological, ethnographical, or otherwise, where people would just bathe publicly on the roof of their house. You have to remember, this is a society who has a very high honor and shame aspect to it. Mm-hmm. And nudity is not acceptable in this world. To be nude, especially seen nude in public, is a very shameful thing. And so while, of course, these houses did not have their own private bathrooms, they often did have their own courtyards or forecourt, which is like a courtyard in front of the house, and would be doing these things in the privacy of their own homes. And we also can't imagine that she's, sitting in a big bathtub or a ritual bath, because these ritual baths, a mikvah or mikvaot in the plural, they don't really come into being until much later in Israel's history, predominantly post-exile. So she's not at like some public bath. There was no such thing in Iron Age Israel. More than likely, she's and this was, again, before the purity ritual baths. And that, is aspect to it that's pretty important.
Yeah.
That what she's doing the bathing for, which we'll come back to that, I'm sure. But, my guess is that she, from what I know of, from what I read in the text and what I know archaeologically, and she's probably within the privacy of her own home in some way. But David's location, being on the roof of his house, and the archaeology of the city of David in Jerusalem there's a lot of, questions and discussion about that. So it's really quite hard to say. I know Elat Mazar, who unfortunately passed away not too long ago, had been excavating the city of David. And in her excavations, she thinks she thought she found like the palace of David. And of course, there's lots of discussion about that and people who agree or disagree. But regardless of which, that part of Jerusalem that is thought to be the city of David was Jerusalem surrounded by deep valleys, and it's very hilly. And it's thought that the elite people, and typically that would be your kings and the royal family, the nobles, would live on the heights, if you will. And being on the heights and then and everything sloping, quite steeply downwards all around you, it wouldn't be a surprise that if he was sitting on the roof of his house, he could see pretty much anything. So these interpretations that have shown Bathsheba bathing completely nude in public, or on the roof of her house, kind of being this temptress, seductress, hey, David, look at me, are completely just foolish. In no way does the text, give us those kind of indications. And so far, David has done nothing wrong.
And similar to our mention of the way that using the little descriptors in the text can really push your reading, if your association with this is she is on the roof, that can really change how you perceive things coming forward. Where if she's in the privacy of her own home, if she's in a private space bathing and he is looking in, suddenly, he's the geography makes this available and he's opening, but is he transgressing? Is he looking somewhere he shouldn't? We maybe start to ask questions of what David's doing, what she's doing, but she's not explicitly in the text, right? Out there in front of everyone, in the eyes for all to see. And our friend Josephus adds a little line to this too, where he says, right, in old Josephus's rendition, who Josephus isn't a friend of women, we should say, right? He has many things to say there, but when he's describing her, he says that she was washing herself in her own house. So even Josephus is kind of putting her there, but the later traditions pushing her closer to these temptress women, moving David away, some from this difficulty, have really taken hold of the imagination with this scene.
Yeah, and I would agree with that because especially for people who come from faith backgrounds, who they've heard for so long that David is a man after God's own heart, he can't have done wrong. She had to have tempted him into this. And I would disagree with that interpretation. And then when you see, pictures of this, paintings or art, they always show Bathsheba on the roof. Like, wait a minute, did you read the passage first?
They don't want to have it with David peeking over the fence looking in, which might be more of the feel you get if you're putting Tom. Peeping David, if she's inside her house. Suddenly this starts to feel very different. And you mentioned some of why she's taking a bath. As the story goes on, David sent messengers to get her. She came to him and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period. Then she returned to her house. The woman conceived and she sent to David. And she says, I am pregnant. Now, I think we should also mention that in this, right, she gets a description. She gets named. Who is this, right? It's Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And so a couple questions I want to ask here. First, right, we got to come back to this why she's bathing because that matters. But also when she gets named, we get her father and her husband. Is that normal for her to be connected still with both in this retelling? And why do we get both of their names?
No, it's not normal. That's the short answer. So when David sees her, he inquires about her. And when he finds out who she is, that she is daughter of Eliam and wife of Uriah the Hittite. So again, when you get married in this world as a woman, remember, this is not a world where you really have last names.
Mm-hmm.
You're known by who your family is, who your father is. As a woman, it's who your father is and who your husband is. So you would be, Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam. But once you got married, you would then be known as Bathsheba, wife of Uriah the Hittite. So the fact that the text gives us both the father and the husband, I think, is giving us a little clue that both these men, her father and her husband, are known to David. And we do get a little bit of this answer later on in the text, where Eliam is thought to be the son of someone who was I can't recall their name, but was a counselor to the king. And so he knows the family. But then we also learn later who Uriah is. And Uriah is a Hittite, so he's not even an Israelite. But we learn later on that he is one of David's mighty men. He's one of his entourage, the men that were with him when he was hiding from Saul, who were kind of considered his core group. And so not only does David know her family, he knows her husband. Now, while he may not know who she is, because relationships between men and women who weren't related to each other were not very typical, but he knows who her family is. And yet he still progresses with what he wants. And even though he knows that she's married, he knows her family, he knows her husband, he still summons her. And
it just adds layer on layer of the transgressions that David gets into here.
Yeah.
Adding into that, right, the context that she was purifying herself after her period. How is that setting up? We mentioned this earlier with the bathing. How does that either connect with the bathing or kind of inform us about the character? Because we're starting to get some character insights with David with this. I know who they are and bring her anyways. Is this just basic information that's a throwaway? Because we don't usually get that in the Bible. There's not usually wasted lines. So what is this doing here?
Yeah, and I think this is an editorial comment that a little bit later is trying to explain why she was bathing to begin with. Now, of course, there's some scholars who interpret this, slightly differently, but I think the general consensus is that when he sees her bathing, she is not, because bathing was not a typical,
not a daily activity
in this world. You typically had to have a good reason for bathing, and one of those is ritual purity. And again, you would get, if we had time, you'd get into all those questions about, okay, well, when did the Israelites actually know about the laws that were written down in Leviticus and Deuteronomy? But let's just take this with the text as what it says. She's, the editor is telling us, okay, this is why she was bathing. And so we do also get another clue into the content of her character, that she has one physical character. We know that she is at the prime time to conceive. And two, because, if you're going according to the law, a woman is unclean the time that she's on her period and the week afterwards. And so during those 2 weeks, assuming it's 2 weeks, she's not to have sex with her husband. And so after those 2 weeks, then she is, of course, in the cycle of fertility cycle, would be at the right time to conceive, if possible. And so the fact that one, she's at that right moment to conceive, and two, the content of her character, that she is a devout woman, that she is doing what is expected of her ritually, cultically.
So she's doing everything she's supposed to, where she's supposed to. And it's in this moment that, right, David sent for her, right? And it says she came to him and he lay with her. And there's always the discussion of translation when we're getting things of he lay with her, right? This is the moment of sex. But in this, as we've talked about before with these power dynamics, the king has sent for her. He has summoned her to the palace. There isn't a negotiation, as far as we get in the text, of the even ability to consent or not here. The king has summoned her and she has come. And then as a result of this, she gets pregnant. But as we're starting to stack these pieces together, the feeling of them gets very different, leading up to that one little moment, the only words we get from her where she says, I am pregnant, right? That's the only moment we hear from her in this whole story.
Right. And most of the action is is done by others. She has very limited action and she has a very limited voice.
Yeah.
The only time we hear from her is when she tells David that she is pregnant. Now, I want to go back to the power dynamics thing, if you don't mind, because I think this is really important because our narrator has given us that clue at the very beginning of the text that David's home when his armies are out to war. And so he's much more powerful than he was before. And as a powerful king, he doesn't need to go out to war, hence why he's home. And if we keep that sense of the clue that the character of David is as a powerful king, the power dynamics between him and her, even though he knows who she is, she doesn't have a choice in this matter. And it is essentially, rape.
And also with her husband being gone, her husband is a part of the household that is with the army. So that internal dynamic of who is representing who in public spaces, he is removed. And David knows. Once I get the names here, I know he's gone.
Yeah, I know he's gone. I know I could take advantage of this situation. And what's interesting is that this chapter in chapter 11 has a parallel passage a couple chapters later with David's own children, where Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar. And so you have the rape scene here followed by the rape scene there.
Yeah, and we have a discussion talking about that as well. We'll put the link to this description, right, to go through some more difficult passages related to David's household if you're interested in hearing more conversation about that. And I want to make a note as well, because I mentioned Josephus earlier, and Josephus isn't always a friend to women. In Josephus's rendition, when she is pregnant, he changes things a little bit, and she sends to the king that he should contrive some way for concealing her sin. So as we're saying, right, Josephus, not necessarily a friend here, but maybe not moving the bath part, but now moving the cover-up, taking the cover-up that's about to come away from David. Josephus puts it with Bathsheba, but I think naturally we have to get to the cover-up part because David finds out she's pregnant.
It's her fault. Yeah.
Yeah. And the results for the pregnancy, if she is found to be with child and her husband is gone, the consequences of this are going to fall on her. David might be able to just kind of drift back into the shadows if there's a finger pointing situation, which interests me that David goes to such extent here to do the cover up that he does.
Yeah.
Which feels odd given the fact that he could just drift away. So I don't quite know what to make of that part.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point. It just kind of screams like Godfather, Sopranos
yes.
to me, just trying to, get what you want. And, maybe he wanted to, I don't know if I'm being generous with my interpretation. Maybe he wanted to, do right by her in the only way. But I mean, he doesn't get to that point until later because he has like plan A and plan A fails, and then plan B and plan B fails. And ultimately, plan C is what he has to do and what he does do. And so he summons Uriah from the front line.
Now, come get a home visit.
Yes. And if I imagine Uriah, I would be freaked out about, oh no, something's wrong, because you don't summon your warriors, your soldiers from the front line. And in ancient Near Eastern warfare, soldiers take an oath before battle, usually to abstain from certain things. And at least, in Israel, as we see in some other texts, one of those things to abstain from was sex.
Yeah.
So for him to be summoned to go home, and the way I imagine it is, he approaches David, and David's like, "What's up, bro? How's the battle?" Just
Welcome
trying
back.
to play it. Welcome back. You should go home, see your wife, wash your feet. Which, for those of you who don't know, wash feet can often be a euphemism in the Hebrew Bible for genitalia. And so the washing of the feet, while that was a real, practice for hospitality, actually washing of the feet, in this case, it's a euphemism for, have sex with your wife, because he's hoping he'll go home, have sex with Bathsheba, and then he'll think the baby.
This was my kid. I came home. I washed my feet during the battle, and David's free and clear.
Yeah, exactly. But Uriah doesn't do that, does he?
Well, and in this, the euphemism part of what we have going on here, I think is worth sitting on a moment. As we say, right, he does say, go home and wash your feet. Uriah denies, as you mentioned, because a part of this abstinence, likely a part of why he's not going home to do these things, that doesn't work. Then David gets him drunk because Uriah slept at the palace. David gets him drunk and tries to send him home again. Uriah still doesn't do this. And then that's when we get this moment of Uriah being sent back, carrying his death note, essentially, the instructions to put him into this spot and to get him killed. And again, if we're thinking through the character and how the information of the narrative is informing us of the character, David, out of this trio, is coming off far the worse of the other individuals are very much concerned with purity and ritual purity, whether it exists or not yet, but in the text, right, doing the right things here. And David is sleeping with someone else's wife, bringing the soldier home, trying to get him to break this purity that he would have taken as a soldier, now sending him back home with his death note. It feels hard to have any kind of positive view of David, despite what the normal rendition of the story might be.
I agree. You see Uriah being a man of honor.
Yeah.
And you see that contrasted quite clearly with David. David is acting dishonorably, while Uriah could have completely taken advantage of the situation, gone home, broken his vow, had sex with his wife, had some good food. And the second time David does this, he gets him drunk because he wants him to, lose his clear judgment, his clear thinking. And even that doesn't work. And both times Uriah sleeps at the palace, at the gate, I think, with the servants. So, he's showing himself. So both Bathsheba and Uriah have shown themselves to be people of character, honor, and integrity. And David, who you would expect to be, the irony being that David, who you would expect to be a man after God's own heart, a man of character and integrity, really fails here. And so ultimately, when Uriah goes back to the front lines, carrying, as you said, his own, death warrant, and that's it. And the plan works, although what David tells Joab, the commander, to do, it ultimately doesn't go well, the plan. But the ultimate plan for David is for the death of Uriah to occur at that battle. And that does happen.
Yeah, because you get when Joab sends the messenger back to give David the update, and he says, when David gets mad because we lost some people here, tell him Uriah the Hittite is also dead. And David does get mad because, again, David's cover-up now has not just killed Uriah, but it's also killed other individuals in this battle. But he hears Uriah is dead, and he goes, oh, yes, okay.
Okay,
oh, well, that's really too bad.
Don't worry about it. These things happen. Mistakes
battle.
are made.
You can't all be as good as me, but I'm back here at the palace being a very good boy. Don't worry about anything. We're all okay. And then Uriah's dead. David marries Bathsheba.
After her time of mourning.
After her time of mourning. But it's not the end of the story, because we then get that Nathan the prophet coming in, and the story of the rich man and the poor man and the sheep. And David, in his obliviousness, misses the very obvious message here. But the outcome of this, right? Uriah has died. These other individuals have died. He's now forced Bathsheba into marrying him. And the consequence is that the child dies, not David.
It's one of them, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And in this story, the unraveling that we get here, how does this fit in to the larger context of David's household? You mentioned some of the stories that come right after this, but in this story of 2 Samuel 11 and 12, David and Bathsheba, should we be reading this out more? Often it gets kind of pushed into its own, of here's this little moment and here's the nice Nathan scene, but how do we need to contact this with these stories that come after for the fall of David?
Yeah, I often think of the book of 2 Samuel, if you think of it as far as like kind of that classic, narrative arc where you've got the buildup of all of David's successes in the first half of the book. And then here you have the climax, if you will, for the lack of a better term, and David's sin, David's failures. And it's multiple sins, multiple failures here. And then the rest of the book is that arc on the decline, where you have the punishment of the house of David. And when Nathan, tells David of the consequences, the punishment, one of the things he said is that the sword will never depart from your house. And as I alluded to a little bit earlier in 2 Samuel 13, David, I think it's 13, David has the crown prince is Amnon. And then he has two more children that are mentioned, Absalom and his daughter Tamar. And Tamar and Absalom are full blood brothers and sisters. And Amnon is their half brother. And you get this story that has distinct parallels to the David and Bathsheba, where Amnon, as the text says, is in love, and you should use air quotes here, with his half-sister Tamar. And he and his cousin devise a plan to get him to be alone with her. And that plan is where Amnon pretends to be sick. And of course, David is very concerned about him. He is his son. He's the crown prince. And he says, what can I, I'm paraphrasing, of course, but he says, basically, what can I do for you? And he said, oh, can you have Tamar, my sister, come make, the bread cakes or the dumplings. We've talked about that elsewhere, in my sight. And so you kind of get the impression from that text that he has his own house. And so I kind of imagine, well, I wonder if it's like a, palace compound. He is the crown prince. What is her role in this? Does she have a special role? I think we talked about that in the food episode, so we can refer people back to that one. But ultimately, he takes advantage of this situation, and he also rapes his sister. And when David hears about it, he does nothing. He does nothing. And so part of what Nathan says after the incident with Bathsheba and Uriah and military is when the sword never departs from your house, someone from within your own household is going to rise up against you and try to take the kingdom from you. And unfortunately, in this world, women were often seen, as property of the men of the family, and oftentimes treated as such. And so, when a man is trying to take over somebody else's household, and in this instance, a man is trying to take over the king's household, you infiltrate the women, you take over the women, you assault them, you rape them. And that is kind of the symbol of you taking over that household. So I know I'm probably jumping all over the place here, but when Absalom finds out that David does nothing to Amnon after he rapes his sister Tamar, Absalom vows to get back at Amnon. It takes a few years, but he does eventually. And then eventually, a little bit of time after that, it is Absalom, David's own son, who is still so angry about David's response to this whole incident that it is he who tries to take over the kingdom, and he infiltrates the harem on the roof of the palace. So what David did in private, Absalom, who's trying to take over the kingdom, does it in public for all to see. And
you have those strong connections between assault in this, between the rooftops, and all of these stories are so intricately tied together the spinning out of David's house.
Yeah. And so scholars often say that all those passages about, after David's, sin with Bathsheba and Uriah and everything is the succession narratives, like who's going to succeed David as king. And I think it's an interesting way of looking at it, but I think that also kind of focuses on David and ignores the women of these passages who are treated rather violently and grotesquely in these passages. And we tend to just gloss over these things and just focus on David. And so, other types of readings want us to stop and listen and read slowly the text and ask of it some questions, even just simple questions like who, what, when, where, why, all those basic little ones. Those will just open the doors to so many other questions. And it's unfortunate that we gloss over both Bathsheba and Tamar, and to a certain extent Uriah as well. We gloss over them in these passages and really fixate on David and his role and the succession of his role as king.
It can be so surprising, though, when you come to the texts that you might think you're very familiar with, asking some of these basic questions. Yeah. If you're trying to put aside the reading that you think you know, the movie version that you think you know, to ask simple things like, where were the characters, can suddenly unpack the story in a whole new way that might be a lot more uncomfortable, but then should also lead to questions of, okay, well, why that uncomfortable reading exists? What's being done to move us away from that into something else? And what's the purpose of that? Because all of this pushing towards Bathsheba, putting her on the rooftop, making her the temptress, this activity is really trying to hedge David in protection in the middle of a story where he should be receiving the blame. And the consequences after make no sense if David is an innocent guy in this story. So why are you trying to be apologetic for him here? Look at what comes next. What's the setup? Right. Is that story.
There's a couple of things I tell my students is one, sometimes we have to, especially if you're familiar with the Old Testament Hebrew Bible at all, we tend to skim read. Yeah. And that's one reason why people think, oh, Bathsheba's on the roof, because we're just skimming the passage or we think we know it. But But one little thing that you can do is you can read the passage out loud. I know it sounds a little silly, but reading it out loud, well, not only does it help you imagine how the original audiences might have heard this passage, but it also forces you to slow down and hear the text in a more deliberate way. And I think the other thing that we need to remind ourselves to do is to keep reading. Because our biblical authors and editors did a fantastic job editing and compiling this together. And there's so many little Easter egg clues from one passage into the other. And if you just read the passages that, are the highlight of that book or that particular section, you do miss out on so much.
And Bathsheba, her story doesn't end with the death of that child, right? David and Bathsheba are the parents in the narrative of Solomon, who becomes king, and Bathsheba comes back into the narrative at the beginning of 1 Kings when there is this handoff of power of Nathan and Bathsheba.
David's dying.
David's dying, and Nathan and Bathsheba are maybe doing a little bit of conspiratorial activity themselves. And there's this whole, remember, you promised Solomon, we never get any promise that Solomon is going to be king, but you promised that Solomon was going to be king after you. And David goes, oh, yeah. And so Bathsheba has remained in the court, and here, after biding some time, is able to get her son onto the throne.
And she's the queen mother. And that is the most powerful female position in this world that a woman could have. The way I always kind of imagine it, when Nathan and Bathsheba go to David, because like you mentioned, we have there's nothing in the text that says that she and David and Nathan had this conversation beforehand. And I almost get the feeling like she's saying, dude, you owe me.
Yeah.
And he, there's so many different ways we could look at this scenario, but ultimately Solomon does become king and she becomes the queen mother, the most powerful position in that world. And so you think, okay, that's, you may not know that there's, that kind of, I don't want to say it's a happy ending because it's not, but that she does give some good things that happen, even though this horrible thing did happen to her.
It is one of those, as you said, if you keep reading, she stays and she continues through this, which is unique for a female character in a lot of these narratives that are often introduced for a moment because something is typically going to happen to them, and then they're removed from the narrative when we continue on. So her reappearance here later and her engagement in political maneuverings to get her son onto the throne, there's a contested succession here, and she's able to succeed. And then Solomon takes the throne and does what people ascending the throne do, and he kills a ton of people. And maybe David told him to kill these people. It's again a
very Godfather-esque.
nice and clean story there, but that within
Solomon's Michael.
All of this gets tied back together to chapter 11 and this moment of David and Bathsheba, and is not as neat and as nice or enjoyable in any way as it often gets portrayed, but is all there in the text if we just take the time to read it.
Yeah, I agree. And the thing about these particular books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, in the Hebrew Bible, they're known in a collection as the former prophets. But biblical scholars also sometimes call them by another name, and that's the Deuteronomistic History, because they have this theology that's often referred to as the Deuteronomistic theology that's introduced in Deuteronomy. You see it in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, where the way the text describes it is blessings and curses. Now, when I think of curses, I think of Harry Potter, but so I tend to use, consequences. But you see in these texts, this thread all throughout those books that if you obey the covenant, you'll be blessed with, if you disobey, there's consequences. And one of the things that's worth noting here with the David episode is that he really fails. And he fails big time. And and one of the things that I like about these groups of texts is that they are not necessarily afraid to show even Israel's most infamous king in a negative light. He failed, he broke the covenant, and there's consequences. Now, of course, the consequences, affect kind of more arose around him than him in a lot of ways. He still lives, as you mentioned earlier, but still, that's one of those threads that if you read these texts carefully, you will see it's almost like a really bad soap opera. If you see someone disobeying the covenant, then you should know, okay, there's going to be some sort of consequence. It's going to happen, whether it's sooner or later.
The payback episode is coming for you. You just got to wait a couple chapters and we'll get there.
Right.
But it's going to come back around.
It'll come.
Well, Cynthia, thank you so much for taking the time and walking us through some of these questions, complicated questions, and often uncomfortable answers with them as well. If you have follow-up questions, if there's something that we opened here that you'd like to see more of, let us know. You can leave it down in the comments. You can reach out via email, and we can come back around to some of those things because, as we've said, these stories are all tied together. And so this opens up things that somebody's payback comes in a future date, in a future story, so we can come to those there. But for today, I think let's leave it there. People are probably satisfactorily uncomfortable, and we can let them go on and mull on that for the rest of the day. So Cynthia, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm really happy to get to talk to you as always. For all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, I'm Jordan Jones. Until next time.